Hello, and welcome back to the Inside Java podcast, a podcast about everything Java brought to you directly from the team at Oracle that builds Java. My name is Chad Arimura, and today is episode 6, Project Skara. My guests are Joe Darcy and Erik Duveblad. Joe, why don't you kick things off by giving us an overview of Project Skara?
Skara was an effort to change the source code management system for the JDK from Mercurial to Git. This had a number of pieces, selecting which SCM we were going to use besides Mercurial, and then after we'd selected Git, selecting which hosting provider for Git we would use for the JDK sources.
Then there's also, of course, all the engineering challenges around once you settle on source hosting provider, SCM. There's all these boundary systems. Like we're most likely not going to get exactly what we want of any SCM nor any hosting provider. So there's going to be customization on top. That customization is going to have to work with boundary systems like infra systems, etc. So a lot of work went into that too. That may not always be seen as much.
And a lot of that work was providing conceptual continuity for the community from what we were doing before to what we're doing now and going into the future so that we could keep everyone happy and productive.
Well, before we go too far, why the name Skara?
I think that's on Joe.
Yes. Online, one of the derivations of the word Git is a derivation of the word Geet, where a Geet is someone from Geatland, which is currently part of Sweden. So, and Skara is the capital of Geatland. And also we do have a strong contingent of engineers from the Stockholm office, including Erik, so it seemed appropriate to choose that. I did check with some of my Swedish colleagues that there weren't negative associations with Skara as well, to make sure it was a culturally appropriate name to choose.
I noticed that one of the JEPs, 296, was all about the JDK forest and consolidating that down. And that was back in 2016 it was created, so almost 5 years ago. Did you imagine that Project Skara would evolve this far and end up choosing an entirely new SCM at the time?
JEP 296, to consolidate the Mercurial forests we were using into a single repo, predates Skara, but it is foundational work for what would become Skara. We had been evolving how we used SCMs in the JDK at a broad level for several years, even prior to JEP 296. We used to have a graph of integration forests, which then we changed to a tree of integration forests. And over time, we reduced the number of integration forests. So we were leveraging both improved test reliability and better CI systems we were using in the JDK. We were getting toward a simpler way of doing development where there were fewer forests, so people could just push to one forest and have it propagate easily. One of the advantages of the changes from JEP 296 is that we could do atomic commits across the hotspot virtual machine, Java-C, as well as the core libraries, which is a very powerful capability to have. A feature like Lambda in JDK 8 or Jigsaw in JDK 9 spans all those areas, and being able to update them simultaneously all at once is a much more efficient way to work. And we couldn't do that nearly as efficiently when we had so many little repositories and had to have the changes propagate around among them. One small change that benefits from the new arrangement as well is something simple like updating the JDK for the start of a new release, because that also does cross the virtual machine, Java-C, and the core libraries. And now we can do that atomically in a single commit.
But I do think it's fair to say that, at least for me and Erik Duveblad, another Swede, who did a lot of the work on the consolidation, I think we at least had an inkling at the time that this could certainly lead to an SCM change. Not that it was required, but we were setting ourselves up for doing that in the future if we so wanted to.
Right. And Git had become pretty popular by then as well. Was that always one of the primary ideas for SCM?
I don't think we had a strong leaning towards any SCM, but we did a lot of research looking at, they were both created almost exactly on the same time, Mercurial and Git, and they kind of evolved a little bit differently. But looking back just a few years, a lot of it's probably attributed to GitHub becoming so popular, but Git really took off. If you look at, for example, the Stack Overflow survey that they do each year, they used to ask what version control system people were using for their projects, both personal and professional. But once the respondents for Git started going over 90%, they stopped asking the question in the survey because there wasn't really any point any longer. I mean, so I'm not saying, in no way is it that Git is technically that superior. I think they are both awesome version control systems. It's sort of more just like happened that Git became so popular, and with that comes a lot of investment into the tooling. So when a tool reaches that level of popularity, like 90% plus of all software projects uses it, then you see a lot of investment into performance optimizations, new features, third-party tooling. So a whole ecosystem sprungs up around it, and that makes it a very appealing choice, of course, when you're looking at different source control management systems.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of tooling and ecosystem, GitHub was part of that decision as well. Did you look at, I'm sure there were some objections to hosting it anywhere because previously it was self-hosted Mercurial. Tell us about that decision.
Yeah, as you can imagine, it's a pretty interesting discussion to have, particularly in an open source community. And I think I think the most points that come up are often around independence and being able to not being locked in to a particular provider. Like you don't ever want to run the risk of locking in neither the actual source nor comments or discussions so that you can't change in the future. Because if you're looking at a project like OpenJDK, which has been around for longer than GitHub has been around, then you can almost certainly say that we are going to be around, perhaps even when GitHub is no longer the preferred choice. So we're going to have to transition again in the future. So I think when we were going into this, all of us working on this really understood the implications here that whatever we do, we need to make sure that we are independent of wherever the sources are ending up being hosted. And that was a big driver for Skara to make sure that we covered all our bases and we made sure that all the data, including metadata like discussions and comments and all these other kinds of contributions, not just code, that they could be transitioned to a new provider in the future.
And this tooling developed for Skara does work with both GitHub and GitLab platforms, and the URLs that are put from the Skara tooling into the JBS bug database to link the issues to the pull requests to use OpenJDK URLs as opposed to URLs from the hosting provider.
Right. I saw that. So that's a good segue. We're starting to talk about the tooling that you guys have been hard at work on, particularly around avoiding lock-in and maintaining some of the previous workflows that contributors were used to. Let's talk about that tooling. What are some of the most important tools or some of the most popular ones that have been created?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, Chad, avoiding lock-in has been a big part of the design here to make sure. And as Joe mentioned, one way of doing that is always use independent URLs, as in we do a lot of redirects from openjdk.java.net, the home of OpenJDK, so that we don't end up with github.com links everywhere, for example. We also work a lot with OpenJDK mailing lists, which is the backbone for all of the communication in OpenJDK. So we are bridging back and forth between comments on GitHub and emails on the mailing list, because if you squint a little, it is almost like the comment section on a pull request that is fairly similar to a mailing list thread. So we try to go back and forth between those. We can also go back and forth between comments on a review. So if you make a comment on GitHub saying, I think this line should maybe use this wording instead, then that will become an email on the OpenJDK mailing list, and someone can reply to the email on the OpenJDK mailing list, and we bridge it back as a reply to the comment on GitHub. This is one of those ideas that you go like, you would be crazy to attempt this. Most likely, you would end up in so many corner cases. But a big shout out to Robin Westberg here, one of the other engineers on Skara. He has done an amazing job on making sure this all hangs together and actually works. It's really cool when you see it in practice. So I think that has been appreciated, because I know maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, but there are a few scaling issues for larger teams with GitHub, and this is one of the ways we are tackling that a little bit also.
So I think that's worth reiterating. Just to be clear, what you're saying is that multiple contributors to a single PR can be discussing that pull request either by mailing list, just replying to a normal mailing list, or using the GitHub web interface at the same time.
Yeah, That's correct. And you can even take it a few steps further if you want. And this is not due to us, this is due to other tooling in the GitHub ecosystem. But someone can reply from within their IDE. Some of the IDEs can have pull request comments and editors. Someone can use GitHub for mobile and reply while on the go on their phone. A person favoring the CLI command line can use one of several CLI tools to also work from the command line if they so wish. So
Wow.
this is something we really wanted to try to achieve. So instead of saying everyone should use this or everyone should use that, we want contributors to use the tools that they feel the most productive with. Whether you're coming from a more, should we call it old school open source background with mailing lists and that kind of infrastructure, or if you're coming at it from a mobile first perspective where you want to use your iPad or iPhone to make a comment on a pull request.
So it's been about, I'm guessing about a month now where the main line's been on GitHub. You mentioned some scaling issues. Overall, how has this worked so far? And let's talk about those scaling issues.
Well, we have kept an eye on people making pull requests and getting them integrated after the transition. It was about less than 8 hours between the time that the Mercurial repos went read-only until we had the first push into the Git mainline repo. So we were happy that people were able to get going again right away. It was a holiday weekend in the US at the time, so it wasn't too much activity, but things did start picking up afterward. There were a lot of pushes done the week leading up to the transition, people clearing out their queues of changes. And since the transition, people have largely been able to keep on working. The change rate's been at least as high as it was previously. It is an adjustment. Many of us who'd worked on the JDK for a while, 12 years, got very comfortable with our Mercurial workflows. So we do know some of our colleagues don't like Git, but they don't have to like it as long as they know how to use it.
So I should, I can just reiterate a little bit on Joe's thoughts there that for the first week after transition, we did so a little bit of a lower activity. And when I say activity, we are talking about a number of commits being pushed. So OpenJDK is mainly worked on during regular workdays, so in the work week. Most contributors are employed to work on OpenJDK. So you see a large percentage of the work coming in Monday to Friday, and then it goes down over the weekend. That is why we transitioned over the weekend, of course. But the first week we saw a little bit lower, maybe 75% of the usual number of commits, so 60 instead of 80. But since then, after the first week, we really picked up steam. And we are now happily producing around the same, a little bit more than we usually do, so a little bit higher activity, which is super, super cool and exciting to me as one of the engineers on the project, that we can make this huge transition, and the project just keeps on going. That was impressive from everyone in the community, really preparing and stepping up when needed, so that everyone could just keep on getting work done. I think that's awesome.
And why we've been talking about the transition of the JDK mainline repositories to Skara, part of the reason the transition went smoothly is because many of the downstream OpenJ projects had transitioned to Skara previously. So projects like Amber and Valhalla and Panama, as well as FX about a year earlier, had transitioned and kind of helped lead the way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's awesome, guys. Well, congrats so far on the successful migration. What a really great feat that you guys have accomplished. So before we move on from tooling, we haven't properly talked about some of the key ones. So I've noticed that JCheck, or the bot responsible for maybe JCheck, seems to be pretty active. And also I've noticed that the Webrevs that the team has used traditionally to review change sets is still active. Tell me about how those are all working.
Yeah, so we touched upon this a little bit, that I do think that GitHub is, I think it's fair to say that it's primarily optimized for perhaps small to medium-sized projects. So OpenJDK has around 200 to 250 active contributors to the JDK repository, which is the main repository for the JDK project. That's fairly big for a GitHub repo. And there you start to see that some of the choices were perhaps a little bit more towards teams of perhaps, let's say, up to 50. And after that, you do need some assistance to handle the number of pull requests, the number of comments, to keep track of everything. This is not only something that OpenJDK does. You see this for a lot of big GitHub repositories. And one thing many projects do, and we do as well, is that we feature commands you can write in comments for a pull request. So this is similar to back in the IRC days or many other old school platforms. If you start a comment with a slash, then it could interpret it as a command instead. And this is where you can start to interact a little bit with the tools we've written. Because on these platforms, you can't really tell, or you can't tell by the content, but it's equally possible for programs to make comments and interact with you on these platforms as other users. So a lot of the tools got a little bit of a, should we call it a 2020 upgrade? So they're not only available in CLI form, they're also available as little bots on these platforms, chatting away with you. So you can now get friendly messages if, for example, you have a merge conflict with a target branch, or if you have trailing white space in the source code, or if you are missing something else. For example, we don't want symlinks in the repository, nor do we want the binaries from many projects. You'll get warnings that you can interact with. So that has been a little bit like a modern overhaul of some of the tools that has traditionally been used for OpenJDK development, which has been really cool and I think appreciated.
I did want to provide a definition of what a Webrev is, since people might not know. A Webrev is a standalone representation of a change that's generated traditionally by a K-shell script that we've used for a long time in the JDK and previously at Sun. So one advantage of it, it does provide diffs in many different formats, and you can just zip it up or tar it up and show it around. But it doesn't have the sort of interactive functionality of a platform like GitHub. But I will admit there are some changes. I still like looking at a Webrev to get a sense of how it's going. Providing the Webrevs does allow some of the more experienced engineers who might have been accustomed to that way of doing the review, a way of having continuity with older school tooling while people are getting used to the newer ones.
Yeah, and I noticed that the Webrevs that you do create, they show the change sets in like 6 or 7 different formats, which is pretty cool. If somebody adds a label to a particular pull request, does that actually get migrated anywhere, or does it just stay on the interface?
So yeah, we are using the labels a little bit to communicate particularly areas that has been changed. So let's say so the JDK repository is vast. We're talking about millions of lines of code, tens of thousands of source files, and hundreds of developers contributing to it. So as you probably can imagine, if you are making a change in one area, it is not like every engineer on the project can come in and review that. There are usually a few engineers tied to a particular area that can help out with reviewing and commenting on your particular change. And it's important for you to reach those engineers. Otherwise, you can easily drown in the number of pull requests without them getting notified or maybe missing your contribution. So what we do is that we have tooling analyzing the files you have changed. And then we are suggesting that you should probably reach out to these groups. For example, if you're making a change to one of the garbage collectors in the JVM, then you will automatically get the label hotspot-gc to indicate that you are changing a file that should probably be reviewed by one of the hotspot-gc developers as a way to aid you in reaching the people who should review your patches and comment on them and make suggestions. And this is again one of the ways where we have to bring a little bit of a custom tooling to make GitHub work well for this large kind of a project.
Wow.
And the tooling does make sure that if you're changing the build system, you don't forget to ask the engineers on build dev to take a look at it.
Right. So when somebody creates a pull request, it can automatically detect the parts of the code that are being affected and create labels, which notifies specific teams that there's been changes and reviews to be reviewed. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's a mapping file currently in the Skara tooling that goes from parts of the repository to the mailing list where those files are discussed.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Okay, so we're talking about contributing. How has contributing changed? You mentioned there's about 250 or so contributors to OpenJDK. How has contributing changed with this migration to Git and GitHub?
So at a high level view, Contributing is fairly similar, or can be similar, in that you can discuss the changes you're thinking about making on the mailing list, and after you get consensus that that's a reasonable thing to do, you develop the change, and it goes through review and eventually gets integrated into the system. But of course, now that the tooling is different at a lower level in terms of the SCM we're using and the logistics of getting the push in.
I noticed that there are many pull requests, but they are either open or closed, but none of them have been technically merged in GitHub language. Is there, I think you call it integrated now. Tell me a little bit why you chose to do it that way as opposed to using the traditional merge function of GitHub.
Yeah, that's a good question, Chad. I think that actually a little bit that we did not use integrated with Mercurial. This is something we sort of come up with for Skara and OpenADK. And this is once again one of those cases where for a large project, part of the default GitHub workflow can become a bit tedious. So whenever you do follow the regular GitHub workflow and you open a pull request, there can be a lot of rebasing if master changes quickly, or if your target branch changes quickly. You can end up doing a lot of rebasing just to catch up. And if you then have, for example, dependent pull request, or you do a lot of work, let's say you have 5 contributions out for review, you can end up rebasing quite a bit, or you end up with a lot of merges on the target branch, which makes following history a bit more complicated. So here we actually did a little command that we call /integrate, which at the end, when you are done, then you can type /integrate, and we squash the commits in the pull request, rebase them on the latest, and then push. This is similar to one of the buttons in the GitHub's default workflow, which is squash and merge. And there's also a rebase, and then there's a merge button. But here another little caveat kicks in, sort of, because the OpenADK project has a more elaborate privilege system than what GitHub has. So GitHub primarily features roles like reporter, you can read access, you can write access, you can be maintainer, you can be admin, so 5 levels essentially. Whereas OpenADK has author, where you have become, that's the step where you get a username sort of in OpenADK, and you have made your first steps. Then you can become committer, at which point you can push commits, and then you can become reviewer. And GitHub doesn't really capture that reviewer level in a way that OpenADK does. And also, from a security point of view, it's a little bit sensitive to give out a whole lot of people direct write access to your main repository. So integrate solves a lot of these concerns in one big swoop, sort of.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that everything is online and visible on GitHub, many of our listeners probably have some great ideas for changes to the language. I have a couple crazy ideas myself. Tell me how we get these things into Java.
You might want to start being less ambitious than changing the language as your first PR. Brian Getz has discussed this a few times, where, especially for language changes, but also for other large library changes, it's important to get consensus and discussion first before you bring code to be reviewed to OpenJDK. Or if you do an experiment and bring code, you shouldn't have any attachment to it going in to have it reviewed. One distinctive feature of OpenJDK development is that we take a very long-term perspective. As you know, Java is 25 years old as of this year, so I've worked in the platform about 20 years. There's still some code I worked on initially from way back when that's still in the platform. So the code we work on today, we expect it to be maintained for decades to come. So it's a very long-term perspective, and that's one of the reasons we have a review process before things go in, because we do expect to be living with it for a long time.
Yeah. In all seriousness, I think that the visibility of being on GitHub is going to be really tremendous for growing the community. Talk a little bit about how the community can get engaged, whether they want to become contributors eventually or even non-contributors. What are some of the benefits, and how do you guys envision the community getting involved going forward?
So I think it's really good that we now, we talked a lot about the customizations we've done, the additional tooling we bring, both for experienced OpenADK developers and also newcomers. But we should point out that people who already know the default workflow on GitHub that they may have used with other projects, they can bring the same workflow over when you're contributing to OpenJDK on GitHub, and it will just work. The bots will help you out and may ask you to fill in a few details, but overall, you can bring that knowledge you already have and then contribute to OpenJDK. So I think that's a really big step for OpenJDK to take. I don't really see it as if you're thinking about in a broader perspective contributing to open source, I don't really think it's valuable that all projects have their own custom workflow. So whenever you want to contribute to project X, you have to learn something, and then you contribute to project Y, you have to relearn all their tooling when all you want to do was contribute. I'm not saying that GitHub is the end to be at all platforms and that workflow is the chosen one, but having a lot of open source projects use the same workflow for getting contributions, that's really powerful, because as a contributor, I mean, you want to contribute to the project you care about. You don't want to get stuck reading upon all these peculiarities for a particular project in exactly the tools they chose. There's no need to differentiate open source project along that axis. It's just better for everyone if they use the same tooling. So that's, I'm hoping that will bring a lot of contributions to OpenJDK in the forms of pull request, but also the visibility. We already seen a few highly valuable reviews coming in from people who have not participated in the community before. That gets me really excited that we have, because a lot of the changes to the JDK platform can be really hard to grok. I have no idea what's going on with all these cool method handles and bytecode spinning that the language folks do. And it can be really complicated to understand the more intricate patches to the VM as well. But some things are patches that any Java developer can have a look at and go like, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Or maybe you should just rename that slightly. For example, changes going into the core libraries. Many of the data structures and the algorithms in there are written in Java in the same way as you write Java for your program. So there I hope to see a lot of value in getting feedback from users already on the patch and contribution level, saying like, yeah, this API, this is really, really nice. Like I could benefit from this immediately over here in my application. And I think that's one really cool way of contributing, just getting feedback in that early stage to new development in OpenJDK.
And it's worth mentioning again that you mentioned earlier, many of the other sub-projects are also using the Skara tooling. So for example, Project Amber, Project Loom, Project Panama, Project Valhalla. There are also repositories in the OpenJDK GitHub organization where contributors and in the community can go in and review and provide feedback to PRs, et cetera. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And we also link to early access binaries if you want to take some of these projects for a spin. I know that's often appreciated that people try something out on a larger real code base. For example, you want to try out Loom, or you want to try out some of the new ideas in Amber. That can be very powerful to take one of the early access binaries, run them, and give feedback to the project at that early stage. Because it's often so much easier to change something in the earlier phases before things are getting hardened by writing the spec, for example, or getting formal reviews. The later you come in with your feedback, the harder it is to make larger changes in response to your feedback.
Using those early access projects in earnest is actually one of the most valuable ways people can contribute to OpenJDK to give feedback on how things work in practice.
Awesome. Yeah. It's also worth noting that we will do specific episodes on each of those projects as well. Well, this has been really great. What lies in the future for Project Skara?
Yeah, I think in the very short-term future, we are looking to wrap up the transition for some of the projects that are still on Mercurial. That's primarily some of the JDK updates projects, so projects like 11U, and then also potentially looking further ahead. You might want to consider transitioning some of the even older updates projects like 8U, etc., to make sure that everyone is using the same tooling and can reap the benefits of all the investments here. And also, of course, responding to feedback. We already got them. Developers can be a little bit picky with their tooling, and they are not shy about expressing their opinions on the tools they are forced to use every day. So I think it's fair to say that we got a lot of feedback, a lot of it positive, but of course we missed things, and of course there are bugs to fix and irritating problems to solve. So in the short term, I just want to polish essentially.
And you can see how busy Erik and Robin have been changing Skara by looking at the Skara tooling itself on GitHub for the Skara repos.
Yes. So if the audience wants to learn more about Project Skara, how can they do that?
One great way is coming to GitHub Universe 2020, coming up at December 8th, where both me and Robin are going to have a session presenting Skara and the work we've done. And we're also going to do a live Q&A after the session.
Awesome. We'll leave a link to your talk in the show notes.
Cool. Thank you.
So this is called the Inside Java Podcast. And we generally end every episode with getting an inside view into our guests' lives, whatever they'd like to share. And so why don't we start with you, Joe? Tell us a little bit about a typical day for Joe Darcy.
Oh, I typically do start the morning with some coffee, as many developers do. It's very important. I have a news intake to see what's gone on since the last day. One thing I've been trying to do more recently is to take some of the time I would have spent commuting and spend that exercising instead. So try to keep fit with everything on this year.
Good.
So I have a 6-month-old daughter at home. I just became a dad.
Congratulations.
So my mornings are usually spent hanging out with my daughter to allow my wife to get some sleep, because she takes care of a lot of the nights. So hanging out with the baby, making sure she's happy. And then, like Joe, I drink a lot of coffee, particularly with the baby now as well, to get into shape, to get some coding done. I usually hook up with Robin over audio and video chat, particularly nowadays when we can't go into the office due to the pandemic that everyone is experiencing. So hanging out a lot on audio and video and chat to talk to everyone and still have that feeling of working together. Then the rest of the day is going to be spent in a terminal. I do most of my work in terminal using VI, cranking out code, much to the demise of Robin, who really likes to write Java code in an IDE. I still write all of my Java code in VI. I'm one of those holdouts. You can't take VI away from my fingers. So that's my day.
Well, I know you're both extremely busy, so I appreciate you taking the time to record this podcast about Project Skara. I'd like to remind the audience that they can go and see all of the stuff we're talking about at github.com/openjdk. We appreciate stars, so go star some of the projects, watch them, subscribe to them, and learn how to become a contributor and be a part of Java. Thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chad.
Thanks, Chad.